In a 2018 survey of 10,000 adults conducted by the Ipsos Mori Social Research Institute, 69% of respondents over the age of 50 reported feeling, on average, 20% younger than their actual age. The gap between felt age and chronological age in that study averaged 12.7 years. A 2012 Gallup poll of 1,030 American adults found that 55% of respondents over 50 identified more with an age group at least a decade younger than the one they technically occupied. In a longitudinal study published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2015, researchers Yannick Steffen and Antonio Terracciano tracked 6,489 adults over a decade and found that individuals who perceived themselves as 8 or more years younger than their biological age had a 41% lower risk of all-cause mortality than those whose felt age matched their chronological age. The Human Mortality Database puts average life expectancy at birth for American women in 2023 at 79.3 years. The average age at first heart attack in men, according to the American Heart Association's 2023 Heart Disease and Stroke Statistics Update, is 65.6. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey for 2022 shows adults aged 55 to 64 spending more on entertainment per capita than any other age cohort. The AARP Research Center reported in 2020 that 72% of workers over 50 believed they were performing their jobs as well or better than colleagues 10 years their junior. In 2021, neuroscientists at Seoul National University used fMRI scanning on 68 adults and found that individuals who felt younger than their chronological age showed measurably younger brain aging patterns in regions associated with memory and attention. The numbers describe something that requires a different kind of account. The phenomenon has a name in gerontological literature: subjective age, sometimes referred to as felt age or cognitive age. It is the age a person perceives themselves to be, independent of the number attached to their birth certificate. And in study after study, the pattern is consistent. People do not drift toward feeling their actual age as they grow older, they drift away from it. This is not a modern development, and it is not a Western one. Researchers Jackie Smith and Paul Baltes, working at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin through the 1990s and early 2000s, documented what they called a persistent youthward bias and self-perception across cultures, income levels, and educational backgrounds. The bias existed in their samples regardless of health status. It existed among the highly educated and among those who had never completed secondary school. It appeared in industrialized nations and in developing ones. What varied was the magnitude, not the direction. Some populations felt younger by 5 years. Some felt younger by 20. The needle never pointed toward feeling older. The structural explanation matters. Human psychological architecture is not built to process mortality in the present tense. This is the foundational claim of terror management theory, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski, first formalized in a 1986 paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and expanded over 3 subsequent decades of experimental work. The theory, drawing heavily on philosopher Ernst Becker's 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Denial of Death, argues that awareness of one's own mortality creates an existential terror that human cognition manages through a combination of cultural worldview defense and self-esteem buffering. One buffer, perhaps the quietest and most persistent, is the maintenance of an internal self-image that does not update at the same rate as the external body. The mind produces a version of the self that is younger, more capable, less proximate to death. It does this constantly. It does this without instruction. The historical record suggests this compression between felt age and biological age is not new, even if the specific mechanics were only recently measured. Cicero, writing De Senectude in approximately 44 BCE at age 62, described the experience of men who felt that age had done something to the outside of them while the inside remained untouched. The Stoic philosopher, Seneca, writing letters to Lucilius in his late 60s, made nearly the same observation. The language differs, the data these men were describing in their own unquantified way does not. What changes historically is not the experience. What changes is the gap's social stakes. Three converging forces produce and sustain the divergence between chronological and felt age. They are neurological, psychological, and sociocultural. They do not operate independently. The default mode network, the constellation of brain regions that activates during self-referential thinking, daydreaming, and autobiographical memory recall, does not operate on chronological time. Research by Armin Schneider at the University Hospitals of Geneva, along with work by Daniel Schachter's memory lab at Harvard, has consistently demonstrated that autobiographical memory is reconstructive rather than archival. When a 55-year-old retrieves a sense of self, the brain does not pull a dated file, it reconstructs. And it reconstructs from the period of life that generated the densest emotional and autobiographical material. The period in question, consistently, is late adolescence and early adulthood. David Rubin at Duke and colleagues documented what is now called the Reminiscence Bump, a phenomenon first rigorously described in a 1986 paper in Cognitive Psychology, which shows that adults across age groups recall a disproportionate number of their most vivid and personally significant memories from between the ages of 15 and 25. The bump is not random. That developmental window is when identity is forming, when most firsts occur, when emotional intensity is highest, and when the brain's memory encoding systems are, by several metrics, at their peak responsiveness. The memories from that period are the most rehearsed, the most emotionally tagged, the most frequently retrieved. When a 55-year-old is simply sitting and thinking, not reading, not watching, not in conversation, the mind tends to return to that window. The default mode network resurfaces it. The result is that the internal felt sense of self is perpetually anchored to a younger version, not through delusion, but through the basic mechanics of how memory and identity are maintained. That is the first force. The second force is the systematic distortion in how people perceive time itself. Neuroscientist David Eagleman, in research published across several papers and consolidated in his book Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, argues that perceived time slows when the brain processes novel information and accelerates when processing becomes routine. A child experiences years that feel long because almost everything is new. An adult experiences years that feel short because the cognitive demands of daily life have become substantially automated. The distortion compounds. William James, in The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, identified what he called the perennial freshness of distant youthful memories relative to the compressed blur of recent adult years. The years between 15 and 25 are densely packed with subjectively novel experience. The years after 35 can feel, in retrospect, like a single long afternoon. The implication is structural rather than sentimental. The brain's internal clock is not calibrated to calendar years. It is calibrated to novel experience. And since the period of life that felt longest and most substantive to the nervous system was youth, the felt sense of age tends to anchor there. Chronological age advances on its own schedule. Felt age does not receive the same calendar updates. The third force is external and relatively recent. Contemporary Western culture, particularly in its commercial and media dimensions, has undergone what sociologist Mike Featherstone at City, University of London, first described in a 1991 essay in Theory, Culture, and Society as the masking of age, a systematic cultural project in which the markers of aging are aestheticized, commodified, or rendered invisible. The billion-dollar anti-aging industry, the fitness-obsessed self-presentation norms of social media, the commercial messaging that frames 60 as the new 40, all of these operate not merely as vanity operations, but as active cognitive interference. They provide constant external reinforcement for the internal youthward bias. The socio-cultural factor introduces a complication the first two forces do not. Neurological and psychological anchoring to a younger self is largely automatic. The socio-cultural layer, however, is selective. It does not operate equally across populations. Research by Andrew Steptoe and Jane Wardle, published in Psychological Science in 2016, using data from the English longitudinal study of aging, found that subjective age divergence was significantly moderated by socioeconomic status. Wealthier, better educated participants showed larger youthward biases, partly because they had more access to the cultural and physical resources that sustain the fiction. Poorer older adults showed smaller biases, and their physical health outcomes tracked more closely with chronological age than felt age. The gap, in other words, is not uniformly available. It is in part a function of material circumstance. This complication does not dissolve the pattern, it maps onto it. The subjective age gap has not always been a site of psychological pain. Its transformation into a source of difficulty is historically specific. In pre-industrial societies, age was a positional resource. The older a person was, the more information they held that others did not. The more accumulated experience they could trade, the more authority their cohort commanded. In those conditions, the gap between felt youth and chronological maturity was a private irony at most. The body aged, the authority of age, however, accrued. That arrangement began fracturing with industrialization. The sociologist Peter Laslett, in his 1989 book, A Fresh Map of Life, traced the emergence of what he called the third age, a new developmental stage between middle age and dependent old age, made possible by increased life expectancy, retirement systems, and reduced physical labor demands. For Laslett, this stage was potentially a period of fulfillment. In practice, the third age emerged into a culture that had already decided what age meant, and what it meant was proximity to irrelevance. The 20th century formalized that proximity. Corporate retirement ages, age-graded social institutions, and the dramatic acceleration of technology all produced a cultural context in which knowledge became obsolescent faster than before. A person who felt 28 while chronologically 55 was not merely experiencing a pleasant internal sensation, they were experiencing an increasingly dissonant one. The body was getting older, the job market increasingly preferred the young, the culture increasingly reflected their images back at them, the internal self-image stayed young, the external social position did not. Psychologist Erik Erikson's developmental model, published across several works from the 1950s through the 1980s, proposed that the central challenge of midlife was what he called generativity versus stagnation, the question of whether one was contributing meaningfully to the world beyond oneself. But Erikson's framework assumed a cultural framework in which accumulated experience was valued. By the latter decades of the 20th century, that assumption was eroding. The challenge of midlife began to include something Erikson's framework had not fully anticipated: the possibility that the self-knowledge a person carried, the competence they had spent decades building, would not be legible to the institutions around them in the same language it was offered. The gap between felt age and chronological age became painful not because people started feeling younger than they were. People had always done that. It became painful because the external world stopped meeting them there. The psychological literature on subjective age is substantially more optimistic than the cultural one, and the discrepancy between those two registers is itself informative. The Stefan and Terracciano study in JAMA Internal Medicine was not the only research to find protective effects from subjective youthfulness. In a 2013 meta-analysis published in Psychosomatic Medicine, researchers Yannick Stefan, Angelina Sutton, and Antonio Terracciano analyzed data from 6 longitudinal studies covering a combined 17,057 participants and found that feeling younger was associated with better physical health outcomes independent of objective health status, socioeconomic controls, and depression scores. A 2019 study by Sung-Sub Chu and colleagues at Yonsei University in South Korea, analyzing data from 1,699 older adults, found that a younger subjective age was associated with greater cognitive resilience in the presence of objectively measured brain changes. The mechanism proposed by most researchers is behavioral. People who feel younger tend to engage in more physically active behavior, maintain more social engagement, pursue more cognitively stimulating activities, and present more optimistically in medical contexts, which affects both the treatment they receive and the outcomes they experience. The felt age functions as a kind of behavioral thermostat. Set it young and behavior trends toward the activities associated with youth. Set it at chronological age or beyond, and the behavioral profile shifts accordingly. But behavioral mediation is not the complete picture. The Seoul National University fMRI study, led by Jenyoung Chi and published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience in 2018, found that the correlation between younger felt age and younger appearing brain structures was not fully explained by behavioral differences. The brain of a 60-year-old who felt 45 showed measurably less gray matter loss in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex than would be predicted by behavioral variables alone. There appears to be a direct pathway between the psychologically maintained self-image and the neurological substrate that houses it. Here is where the research becomes genuinely uncertain, and intellectual honesty requires sitting in that uncertainty. The causal direction is not fully established. Feeling younger may produce better health outcomes. Better health may also produce a younger felt age. The relationship is almost certainly bidirectional, and the existing longitudinal studies, while suggestive, cannot isolate causation cleanly. The researchers themselves are explicit about this. Stefan and Terracciano, in a 2016 review in Psychological Science and Personality Research, noted that the causal pathways remain incompletely understood. That caution is load-bearing. The positive health correlates of subjective youthfulness are real and replicable. Whether manufacturing a younger self-perception would produce those benefits, whether someone could simply decide to feel 28 and achieve better brain aging outcomes, is an open question the data does not close. Subscribe for more data-driven explorations of the psychology behind how we age and how we don't. New videos drop every week. The protective effects of feeling younger than one's chronological age are documented. They are also incomplete as an account of the experience because the experience is not uniformly pleasant. There's a specific kind of suffering that emerges from the gap, and it does not appear often enough in the research literature, which tends to focus on health outcomes rather than phenomenological texture. It appears more often in clinical psychology literature, in memoirs, and in what sociologists call age identity research. The pain has a particular structure. It is not the pain of feeling old, it is the pain of being treated as old while not feeling old. It is the cognitive dissonance of looking in a mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. It is the social experience of being addressed as a member of a generational cohort that does not feel like home. Psychologist Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California, in research on habit and identity published across several papers from 2002 through 2016, has documented how strongly identity is anchored to behavioral patterns established in early adulthood. The habits, preferences, musical tastes, political intuitions, and social styles formed between 18 and 25 do not merely persist, they constitute, for most people, the bedrock of what they consider themselves. A 55-year-old who still experiences their interior life through the emotional grammar of a 25-year-old is not confused. They are operating entirely as the psychological literature would predict. The confusion is not internal. It is the friction between that interior and an exterior social world that keeps addressing someone else. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, writing in A Phenomenology of Perception in 1945, described the body as a kind of habitual body, a physical schema through which the world is experienced and through which the self is felt to exist. His account was not about aging specifically, but its implications are direct. When the body changes faster than the habitual self-schema can incorporate, the resulting disorientation is genuine. The person is not in denial. They are experiencing a real lag between two different kinds of truth. This is the machinery of the strange pain, not delusion, lag. The clinical literature on midlife, beginning with Carl Jung's 1933 essay, The Stages of Life, and extending through current clinical gerontology, has consistently identified midlife as the developmental period in which individuals confront what Jung called the shadow, the accumulated unlived possibilities, the narrowing of the future, the recognition that the self one imagined at 28 has not fully materialized at 55. That confrontation produces what is clinically described as adjustment disorder, depressive episodes, or existential distress, depending on severity. The American Psychological Association's 2021 Stress in America report found that adults aged 45 to 64 reported higher levels of chronic stress than any other adult age cohort. The National Institute of Mental Health's 2020 data showed that the prevalence of major depressive episodes is actually higher in adults aged 50 to 59 than in adults aged 18 to 25, despite widespread cultural assumptions to the contrary. The stress does not come only from feeling young in an old body. It comes from feeling young in a culture that has stopped taking that claim seriously. Hit the like button if this is resonating. It genuinely helps more people find this content. The research on subjective age and its health correlates is largely framed as positive news, and on one axis it is. People who feel younger, live longer, stay cognitively sharper, engage more fully in their lives. That is not nothing. It is in fact a great deal. But the framing omits a structural tension that the data also describes. The subjective age gap does not widen uniformly with time. It widens fastest between approximately 40 and 65, then narrows again in later life. Research by Markus Wettstein at Humboldt University Berlin, published in Psychology and Aging in 2021, found that longitudinal data from the German Aging Survey, a nationally representative sample of 14,911 adults, found that the youthward bias peaks in the early to mid-60s and then begins declining. The oldest old, adults in their 80s and beyond, tend to show felt ages closer to their chronological age, though still somewhat younger. The implication is that the gap represents a developmental task rather than a permanent psychological posture. The question is whether that task is being supported or undermined by the cultural and institutional environment in which people are aging. Here is what the data points toward without quite saying it.
The gap is largest precisely when the social consequences of aging become most visible and most economically punishing. Age discrimination in employment, prohibited by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967 in the United States, and nonetheless well documented in audit studies, peaks in its practical consequences for workers in their late 50s and early 60s. Research by Patricia Leahy at Texas A&M, published in the Journal of Labor Economics in 2008, used callback audit methodology to show that older workers received significantly fewer callbacks for identical resumes than younger workers, with the gap widening as age increased from 50 to 65. A 2020 NBER working paper by Ian Byrne and Patrick Button extended and replicated those findings nationally. The workers experiencing the largest divergence between their felt competence and their market value are, by age cohort, the same workers experiencing the largest subjective age gap. That is not a coincidence. It is a structural resonance. The psychological buffer of a younger felt age is largest when it is most needed, in the period when the external world is most aggressively communicating that the person's productive years are behind them. The buffer may be adaptive, precisely because the signal it is buffering against is so persistently loud. The question of whether the buffer helps or whether addressing the signal itself would serve people better is one the health outcomes literature sidesteps almost completely. And there is a second structural issue the optimistic framing tends to skip. The benefits of subjective youthfulness are not available to everyone. The Steptoe and Wardall finding on socioeconomic mediation is consistent with a broader pattern in health psychology literature. Interventions and buffers that require material resources, good health, financial security, meaningful work, robust social networks, tend to show larger effects in populations that already have those resources. Feeling 28 at 55 is most plausible and most beneficial when you are healthy enough for that self-image to bear some relationship to functional capacity. When chronic pain, disability, or economic precarity dominate daily experience, the internal compass does not drift as reliably toward youth. The gap, on average, is a protective adaptation. The distribution of that protection, like most distributions in the health literature, is unequal. The gap between felt age and chronological age is not only a psychological event, it is a somatic one, and the body's participation in the experience deserves its own accounting. The proprioceptive and interoceptive systems, the internal sensing mechanisms that register physical state, do not lie. They are not filtered by the reminiscence bump or the default mode network. A 55-year-old who still experiences their identity as anchored to 28 nonetheless wakes up each morning in a body that has been accumulating cellular damage for 5 additional decades. The mitochondrial function is different. The telomere length is different. The cortisol recovery curve after acute stress is different. The inflammatory baseline is higher. The immune response is slower. These are not opinions, they are measurements. The collision between the body's honest report and the mind's maintained self-image is, for many people in midlife and beyond, the central daily experience. Not dramatic, not episodic, continuous. The subtle surprise each time the back registers a protest that would not have been registered at 28. The arithmetic of recovery time that does not match the arithmetic the mind is running. The face in the mirror that requires a moment of calibration before recognition settles. Neuroscientist and author Lissa Feldman Barrett, in How Emotions Are Made, published in 2017, argues that what humans experience as emotion is substantially a product of the brain's ongoing attempt to predict and explain the body's internal state. Applied to the felt age experience, Barrett's predictive coding framework suggests something specific. The brain's predictions about the body's state are generated partly from the self model, which includes the felt age.
When the body's actual state diverges from the prediction, when the knee aches in a way the self model didn't anticipate, when the mirror produces an image the prediction didn't generate, the result is not merely surprise. It is a small moment of prediction error that requires resolution. That resolution can take several forms. The self model can update toward accuracy, the body's report can be minimized or rationalized, or the gap can be held with neither resolution nor denial as simply the condition of being this age in this body at this particular intersection of biological and psychological time. The third option is the one most associated in clinical and psychological literature with what is called successful aging. The term itself is contested. The gerontologist John Rowe and physician Robert Kahn, who popularized it in a 1987 paper in Science and expanded it in their book Successful Aging in 1998, meant it to describe the combination of avoiding disease, maintaining physical function, and sustaining active engagement with life. Critics, including gerontologist Martha Holstein, have argued that the framing imports the productivity norms of younger adulthood into the evaluation of old age, pathologizing the inevitable physical changes of aging and implicitly blaming those who cannot succeed at it. The critics have a point, and so do Rowe and Kahn, and neither point cancels the other. Drop a comment below. How old do you actually feel? Not what you're supposed to say. What does the number inside feel like? Genuinely curious. American culture has done something specific and somewhat strange to the subjective age gap in the last 4 decades. It has simultaneously widened it and commercialized it. The widening comes from delayed life stage markers. Research by sociologist Richard Setterston at Oregon State University and developmental psychologist Barbara Ray, presented in their book Not Quite Adults, documented the systematic extension of transitional periods in American life, the postponement of marriage, parenthood, home ownership, and stable career establishment into the late 20s and 30s. The cultural scripts that previously sorted people into adult by 25 began moving. If 35 was the new 25 and 50 was the new 35, the categories themselves were migrating. The internal self-image had less reason to update when the external categories were migrating in the same direction. The commercialization comes from what cultural theorist Angela McRobbie described in The Aftermath of Feminism, 2009, and what scholars of consumer culture have since extended into midlife research, the conversion of psychological vulnerability into identity purchasing. The 55-year-old who feels 28 is an advertising target, not an anomaly. The entire wellness industry, the exploding market in cosmetic procedures, the athleisure sector, the adventure travel niche, these do not manufacture the felt age gap, they find it, name it back to the person experiencing it, and monetize the recognition.
In 2022, the global anti-aging market was valued at $62.6 billion, according to market research firm Grandview Research. It is projected to reach $93.5 billion by 2030. The projection assumes that the subjective age gap continues to create the same specific anxiety it currently creates. Not that people feel young, but that they feel young while being culturally reminded that the body and the labor market and the healthcare system and eventually the actuarial table will not honor that feeling. The industry's business model depends on the gap remaining painful. Narrowing the gap through cultural acceptance of aging, through social structures that value older adults differently, through the kind of institutional reform that would make a 55-year-old's felt competence legible and monetizable in the formal economy, would cost it a customer. If the gap between felt age and chronological age is both adaptive and costly, the obvious question is whether updating the self-image, bringing felt age into closer alignment with the calendar, is desirable or even possible. The clinical psychology literature is cautious about this framing, and the caution is instructive. Attempts to forcibly update the self-image,
Confrontational therapeutic techniques that emphasize mortality salience, that insist on accepting your age, have consistently shown poor outcomes in older adult populations when applied without integration into a larger therapeutic frame. Terror management theory predicts this. Direct, unmediated mortality salience produces defensive reactions, not acceptance. It makes people cling harder to their cultural worldviews, increase in-group out-group distinctions, and, relevant to this context, often resist the very recalibration the intervention intended to produce. A 55-year-old who is told bluntly to stop thinking of themselves as 28 is not likely to feel 55. They are likely to feel distressed, invalidated, and paradoxically more anchored to their younger self as a defensive refuge. What does appear to work, according to research by Laura Carstensen at Stanford Center on Longevity, whose socio-emotional selectivity theory was first published in Psychological Review in 1995 and has since accumulated an extensive evidence base, is the reorientation of the self toward present emotional richness rather than future temporal extension. Carstensen's research shows that as people age and perceive time as shorter, they naturally prioritize depth of emotional connection over breadth of social engagement. They become, on average, more satisfied with their present lives than younger adults are with theirs. This is the so-called positivity effect in aging research. Older adults attend preferentially to emotionally positive stimuli over negative ones and report higher life satisfaction across most measures than middle-aged adults. Carstensen's data, drawn from longitudinal studies and cross-sectional surveys spanning decades, is among the most replicated in developmental psychology. The implication is not that the subjective age gap should be closed, it is that the relationship between the younger internal self and the current external life can be renegotiated into something other than friction. The 28-year-old inside a 55-year-old body is not a problem to be solved. The evidence suggests it is, in the right circumstances, a resource. What makes those circumstances right is where the research stops being conclusive and starts being suggestive. This channel exists to take complicated psychological research seriously and present it without dumbing it down. If you're finding value here, subscribing is the single most useful thing you can do to support it. The data on subjective age is extensive, replicable, and converging. What it does not capture is the particular phenomenological texture of the experience, the specific quality of holding two ages at once. There is no validated psychometric scale for the precise moment, which virtually every adult over 45 can identify, when the body performs an action the mind did not anticipate needing to plan for. The slight recalibration required when sitting on the floor, the calculation that happens automatically before getting up quickly. These are not dramatic. They do not appear in emergency room statistics. They are the continuous low-frequency transmission the body sends to a mind that is still, somewhere in its architecture, running the self-model of a 28-year-old. There is also no scale for the specific social experience of being invisible to the demographic segment whose cultural products, whose media, whose economic energy the world most consistently reflects. The sociologist Irving Goffman in Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity, published in 1963, documented how individuals manage identities that diverge from social expectations. His framework was primarily concerned with stigmatized conditions, disability, mental illness, race, but the architecture of the experience he described applies with surprising precision to the aging person who does not feel aged. The navigation of an identity that is privately held, the management of information about the self in social contexts, the ongoing labor of presenting a self that will be legible and valued in a context that may not be fully prepared to receive it. That labor is real, and it is not evenly distributed. For women, the intersection of ageism and sexism means the external pressure to not appear old arrives earlier and more forcefully than it does for men. Research by Tony Calanti and Kathleen Slevin in their 2001 book, Gender, Social Inequalities in Aging, documented the gendered asymmetry in aging stigma, what they identified as a systematic double standard in which gray temples on a man read as distinguished and on a woman read as aging. The subjective age gap, filtered through gender, produces different social experiences even when the internal felt age is identical. A 55-year-old woman who feels 28 inside is navigating a different external terrain than a 55-year-old man who feels the same thing. Neither of them is navigating terrain that was designed with their interior experience in mind. There is a structural parallel in the American experience of the subjective age gap that is not decorative, it is diagnostic. In the decade after World War II, the United States underwent a rapid and culturally unprecedented expansion of retirement as a social institution. The Social Security Act of 1935 had established the framework, but it was the post-war period, with its expanding corporate pension systems, its GI Bill-financed suburbs, and its ideological investment in the leisured retirement as the appropriate reward for a lifetime of labor, that made retirement a mass cultural expectation. Between 1950 and 1970, the labor force participation rate for men aged 65 and older fell from 45.8% to 26.8%, according to Historical Statistics of the United States, published by Cambridge University Press.
What followed, documented extensively through the sociological and clinical literature through the 1960s and 1970s, was a wave of what researchers called retirement shock or retirement depression, a pattern of psychological deterioration in men who had been active workers and found the transition to enforced leisure profoundly disorienting. The internal self-image, professional, capable, productive, socially embedded, had no external institutional structure to inhabit. The felt self and the social position had been severed. The parallel to the current moment is not exact. The mechanism today is not retirement. It is something earlier. The slow, partially explicit, partially structural exclusion of older adults from the cultural and economic center of American life, beginning well before formal retirement age. But the structural logic is the same. The internal self-image, anchored to competence and engagement, runs into an institutional environment that is not built to receive it. The gap between felt age and chronological age is not only a private psychological experience, it is the interior experience of a structural mismatch between how people actually are and how the systems around them are designed to treat them. The OECD's 2020 report on ageism in the labor market, drawing on data from 43 member nations, found that 60% of respondents in those countries reported having experienced age discrimination. The same report found that ageism was the most widely reported form of discrimination, more commonly reported than racism, sexism, or disability discrimination in the aggregate sample. This is not a problem of individual psychology. It is a problem of institutional design, failing to catch up to the demographic and psychological reality it is governing. The data describes a specific predicament. The mind does not age at the same rate as the body. The body does not age at the same rate as the labor market's willingness to value it. The labor market does not age at the same rate as the culture's willingness to represent it. These are three separate trajectories running on different clocks, and the person who feels 28 at 55 is standing at their intersection. The evidence that feeling younger is protective is real. The evidence that the protection is unevenly available is also real. The evidence that the gap itself is not a delusion, but a structural feature of human cognitive architecture is well established. What remains genuinely unknown is whether the gap will remain as painful as it currently is, or whether the institutional and cultural environments in which people are aging will develop sufficient flexibility to meet people where they actually are, rather than where their chronological age suggests they should be. The research does not resolve that question. It makes the question more specific. 41% lower all-cause mortality for those who feel 8 years younger than they are, 60% of older adults in 43 countries reporting age discrimination, a $62.6 billion industry monetizing the anxiety the gap creates,
A neurological architecture that keeps returning the mind to its most densely encoded developmental years, regardless of what the calendar says. The person who is 55 and feels 28 is not confused. They are running the software human cognition actually runs, software that was not designed for a world that treats age as a progressive disqualification. The gap is real. The pain is structural. And the question the evidence makes most consequential is not how to close the gap, but why the world built to receive these people was designed to make them feel it so sharply. That is not a question the data answers. It is a question the data makes impossible to avoid. If you made it this far, thank you. This is the kind of content this channel exists to make. Subscribe. Share it with someone in their 50s who you think would find it useful, and leave a comment about what resonated. Your engagement is what keeps this going.